The dust swirled across the narrow mountain pass as General Zachary Taylor squinted through his field glasses, watching the endless column of Mexican soldiers snake through the valley below. It was February 21st, 1847, and what he saw made his weathered face grim with concern. Santa Anna had brought an army that outnumbered his own forces by nearly 4-to-1. Taylor's army of roughly 5,000 men had been spread thin across northeastern Mexico after their victories at Monterrey and the capture of Saltillo. Most of his regulars had been transferred to support General Winfield Scott's planned assault on Veracruz, leaving Taylor with a force composed primarily of volunteers from Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. These were farmers, clerks, and tradesmen who had answered their nation's call to arms, but they had never faced a test like the one approaching. The American position near the hacienda of Buena Vista seemed almost impossible to defend. The narrow plateau was flanked by deep ravines and rocky outcroppings that could easily be turned by a determined enemy. To the east, the ground fell away into a series of gullies that provided perfect cover for advancing troops. To the west, the mountains rose steeply, creating natural corridors that any competent commander could exploit. General Antonio López de Santa Anna, the legendary Mexican leader who had crushed the defenders of the Alamo 11 years earlier, commanded an army of over 20,000 seasoned soldiers. His force included elite cavalry units, experienced infantry regiments, and a formidable artillery train. Santa Anna himself was a master of psychological warfare, having earned a fearsome reputation throughout Mexico and Texas for his ruthless efficiency in battle. As evening fell on February 21st, Taylor's officers gathered around a flickering campfire to discuss their desperate situation. Colonel Jefferson Davis of the 1st Mississippi Rifles, a West Point graduate who would later lead the Confederacy, argued for a fighting withdrawal to a more defensible position. Colonel William McKee of the 2nd Kentucky Infantry insisted they should make their stand where they were, despite the obvious disadvantages. According to historical accounts, documented by the Library of Congress, Taylor made his decision with characteristic bluntness. They would fight where they stood. The general, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready by his men for his unpretentious manner and steady leadership under fire, understood that retreat would likely mean the complete destruction of American forces in northern Mexico. If they ran now, Santa Anna's cavalry would cut them to pieces in the open ground beyond the pass. The American artillery, under the brilliant command of Major Samuel Ringgold and Captain Braxton Bragg, positioned their guns along the plateau's edge. These cannons would prove to be the key to survival in the coming battle. The volunteer infantry regiments took positions along the ridgeline, their Springfield muskets cleaned and ready. Many of these men had never seen combat before, but they had spent months drilling under Taylor's demanding standards. As darkness settled over the Mexican plateau, both armies prepared for what would become one of the most decisive battles of the Mexican-American War. Santa Anna's soldiers, confident in their numerical superiority and their commander's reputation, settled into their camps with the expectation of an easy victory. The Americans, knowing they were vastly outnumbered, spent the night in quiet preparation, checking their weapons and writing what might be their final letters home. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every ounce of American resolve and tactical skill against overwhelming odds. The first gray light of February 22nd revealed the full magnitude of Santa Anna's army, spread across the valley floor like a dark sea. The Mexican general had positioned his forces with the precision of a master strategist, placing his cavalry on the flanks while his infantry formed massive columns in the center. The morning air carried the sound of drums and bugles as 20,000 Mexican soldiers prepared for what their commander had promised would be the destruction of Taylor's impudent little army. Santa Anna opened the battle with a formal demand for surrender, delivered by a flag-bearer who rode boldly across the no-man's land between the armies. The message was written in flowery Spanish diplomatic language, but its meaning was clear: surrender now or face annihilation. Taylor's response was equally direct and considerably shorter. Tell Santa Anna to go to hell, the American general reportedly told his aide. Though the official written reply was somewhat more diplomatic in its phrasing, the Mexican attack began with a thunderous artillery barrage that sent shells screaming over the American positions. The volunteer soldiers, many experiencing their first taste of combat, pressed themselves against the rocky ground as cannonballs whistled overhead. Some of the newer recruits showed signs of panic, but the steadying presence of their officers and the veteran non-commissioned officers, who had served in earlier campaigns, helped maintain discipline in the ranks. As the bombardment lifted, waves of Mexican infantry advanced up the slopes toward the American positions. The attackers moved with parade ground precision, their colorful uniforms and gleaming bayonets creating a magnificent and terrifying spectacle. The 1st Illinois Regiment, positioned on the left flank, opened fire when the enemy came within range, their volley creating gaps in the advancing Mexican lines that were immediately filled by reserve companies. The battle's first crisis came when Mexican cavalry, led by General Miwan, swept around the American right flank and charged toward the supply train in the rear. If successful, this maneuver would have cut Taylor's army off from their base at Saltillo and trapped them against the mountains. Colonel Archibald Yell's Arkansas Cavalry Regiment, despite being heavily outnumbered, charged directly into the Mexican horsemen in a desperate attempt to buy time for the infantry to reposition. The collision between the two cavalry forces was brutal and decisive. Yell himself fell in the melee. His horse shot from under him as he tried to rally his men for another charge. The Arkansas troopers, scattered but not broken, fought a running battle back toward the main American line, while Mexican lancers pursued them with drawn sabers. The sacrifice of the Arkansas cavalry provided just enough time for Taylor to shift reserves to meet the threat. Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery battery, positioned on a commanding height, proved to be the salvation of the American right flank. Bragg's cannoneers, working with mechanical precision despite the chaos around them, poured devastating enfilade fire into the advancing Mexican columns. The effect was catastrophic for Santa Anna's forces, as grape shot and canister rounds tore gaping holes in their formations and forced them to seek cover in the rocky terrain. Meanwhile, on the American left, the 2nd Kentucky Infantry under Colonel William McKee found themselves facing a massive Mexican assault, led by General Amputia's division. The Kentuckians, many of whom were experienced hunters and marksmen, made every shot count as they poured disciplined volleys into the attacking formations. McKee himself moved up and down the line, encouraging his men and helping to maintain their formation even as Mexican bullets whistled around him. The morning's fighting had been fierce but indecisive. Santa Anna's attacks had been repulsed, but at a terrible cost to both armies. The Mexican general still held overwhelming numerical superiority, and his soldiers had fought with courage and determination despite their heavy losses. As the sun reached its zenith over the battlefield, both commanders knew that the afternoon would bring even more desperate fighting. The afternoon of February 22nd brought the most dangerous moment of the entire battle for Taylor's outnumbered force. Santa Anna, frustrated by his morning failures but far from defeated, had reorganized his army for a coordinated assault that would test every weakness in the American position. The Mexican commander concentrated his strongest division under General Francisco Perez for an attack on what appeared to be the most vulnerable point in Taylor's line, the gap between the 2nd Indiana Regiment and the 2nd Illinois Regiment. The attack began with another thunderous artillery barrage, but this time Santa Anna's gunners had found their range more precisely. American soldiers hugged the ground as solid shot crashed into their positions, sending showers of rock and dirt flying through the air. Lieutenant Colonel William Bowles of the 2nd Indiana watched grimly as several of his men were carried away on stretchers, victims of the increasingly accurate Mexican fire. When the bombardment lifted, a massive column of Mexican infantry, estimated at over 4,000 men, advanced directly toward the center of the American line. These were not raw recruits but veteran soldiers who had fought in numerous campaigns throughout Mexico. They moved with disciplined precision, their bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun as they climbed the rocky slopes toward the waiting Americans. The crisis deepened when the 2nd Indiana Regiment, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers pressing against their position, began to give ground. What started as an orderly fighting withdrawal quickly threatened to become a rout as panic spread through the ranks. Some soldiers threw down their muskets and ran toward the rear, creating gaps in the line that the advancing Mexicans were quick to exploit. Colonel Jefferson Davis, observing the crisis from his position with the 1st Mississippi Rifles, made a crucial decision that would help save the day. Without waiting for orders from Taylor, Davis led his regiment in a flanking movement against the advancing Mexican column. The Mississippians, armed with rifles that gave them superior range and accuracy compared to the smooth-bore muskets carried by most soldiers, opened a devastating fire into the Mexican ranks from an unexpected angle. As historical accounts from the emerging Civil War organization indicate, the fighting in this sector became particularly intense as Mexican soldiers pressed forward. Despite mounting casualties, Davis's men, many of whom were experienced frontiersmen and hunters, proved remarkably effective in the broken terrain around Buena Vista. Their accurate rifle fire disrupted the Mexican advance and bought precious time for Taylor to organize a counterattack. The arrival of Captain Thomas Sherman's battery of artillery marked the turning point of the afternoon crisis. Sherman, the younger brother of the future Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman, positioned his guns to enfilade the Mexican column and opened fire with devastating effect. The combination of artillery fire from Sherman's battery and rifle fire from Davis's Mississippians created a crossfire that no formation could withstand for long. General Taylor himself rode forward into the thick of the fighting, his presence serving to steady the wavering troops and coordinate the defensive efforts. The old general, mounted on his favorite horse Whitey, made a conspicuous target for Mexican sharpshooters, but seemed to bear a charmed life as bullets whistled around him without finding their mark. His calm demeanor under fire became legendary among his soldiers, who drew courage from their commander's apparent fearlessness. The Mexican assault began to falter as casualties mounted, and the coordinated American response took its toll. General Perez, leading from the front as Mexican tradition demanded, fell wounded while trying to rally his men for one final push. Without their commander's leadership, the attack lost its momentum, and the Mexican soldiers began to fall back toward their original positions. But Santa Anna was not finished. Even as his afternoon assault collapsed, the Mexican general was already planning another attack that would come with the setting sun. He still commanded overwhelming numerical superiority, and his soldiers, despite their losses, remained a formidable fighting force. The Americans had won this round, but the battle was far from over. As February 22nd drew to a close, the battlefield took on an eerie quality in the fading light. The wounded from both armies lay scattered across the rocky plateau, their cries for water and medical attention echoing off the surrounding mountains. The American Medical Corps, led by Assistant Surgeon Samuel Wiley Crawford, worked frantically to treat the casualties while staying low to avoid the sporadic rifle fire that continued to crack across the contested ground. Santa Anna used the approaching darkness to reorganize his battered but still formidable army. The Mexican general had lost nearly 3,000 men during the day's fighting, but he still commanded over 17,000 soldiers against Taylor's force, which had been reduced to fewer than 4,000 effective troops. More importantly, Santa Anna's cavalry remained largely intact, giving him a significant advantage in mobility and striking power. The American position had become increasingly precarious as the day wore on. Ammunition was running dangerously low, particularly for the artillery batteries that had been firing almost continuously since dawn. Captain Braxton Bragg reported that his guns had fewer than 20 rounds remaining, barely enough for one more engagement. The volunteer infantry regiments were in similar straits, with many companies down to their last few cartridges. Colonel William McKee of the 2nd Kentucky Infantry spent the evening hours moving among his men, checking their positions, and trying to maintain morale despite the desperate circumstances. McKee, a lawyer and politician in civilian life, had proven himself an effective combat commander during the day's fighting. His calm presence and encouraging words helped steady soldiers who were beginning to understand the full extent of their Predicament. The night brought new horrors as Mexican cavalry patrols probed the American perimeter, looking for weak points that could be exploited in a dawn assault. The sound of hoof beats in the darkness kept the American sentries on edge, and several false alarms led to brief firefights that accomplished little, except to waste precious ammunition. The psychological pressure on Taylor's soldiers was enormous, as they knew they were surrounded and outnumbered by an enemy that showed no signs of giving up. Taylor himself spent much of the night in conference with his officers, planning defensive measures for what everyone expected would be a final, decisive assault at first light. The general's calm demeanor masked his own concerns about the situation, but he understood that any sign of doubt from the commanding officer would spread quickly through the ranks and destroy what remained of his army's fighting spirit. According to documentation from the American History Central Organization, the casualties from the first day of fighting were staggering for both armies. The Americans had lost approximately 200 killed and wounded, representing nearly 5% of their total force. Mexican losses were much heavier in absolute terms, but Santa Anna could better afford the attrition given his massive numerical advantage. As midnight approached, reports reached Taylor's headquarters that Mexican engineers were building scaling ladders and preparing assault equipment for the morning attack. The intelligence gathered by brave scouts who had infiltrated the enemy camp painted a grim picture of Santa Anna's preparations. The Mexican general intended to launch simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, overwhelming the American defenses through sheer weight of numbers. The American soldiers spent the dark hours in grim preparation, cleaning their weapons and redistributing ammunition to ensure that every man had at least a few cartridges for the morning's fight. Many wrote letters home, knowing that February 23rd might be their last day on Earth. The chaplains moved quietly among the troops, offering what comfort they could to men who faced almost certain death or capture with the dawn. Despite the desperate circumstances, American morale remained surprisingly high. The volunteer soldiers had proven to themselves and their officers that they could stand against veteran Mexican troops and give better than they got. This newfound confidence would be crucial in the trials that lay ahead, as Santa Anna prepared to stake everything on one final, overwhelming assault that would either crush American resistance or break his own army in the attempt. February 23rd dawned gray and cold over the blood-stained plateau of Buena Vista, with low clouds obscuring the mountain peaks and casting an ominous shadow over both armies. Santa Anna had spent the pre-dawn hours positioning his forces for what he intended to be the final assault that would destroy Taylor's stubborn resistance. Once and for all, the Mexican general concentrated nearly 15,000 men for a coordinated attack that would strike the American position from 3 directions simultaneously. The assault began before full daylight with a massive artillery bombardment that surpassed anything from the previous day. Mexican gunners, who had spent the night moving their pieces closer to the American lines, opened fire with devastating accuracy. The concentrated fire tore great gaps in the American earthworks and sent soldiers diving for whatever cover they could find among the rocks and scrub brush. Colonel William McKee's 2nd Kentucky Infantry bore the brunt of the initial Mexican assault, as waves of enemy soldiers advanced up the slope toward their positions. McKee himself stood in full view of his men, ignoring the rifle balls that buzzed around him like angry hornets, and called out encouragement to his soldiers as they poured disciplined volleys into the attacking formations. The Kentuckians, many of whom were crack shots from years of hunting in the forests back home, made every cartridge count as they fought to hold their section of the line. The crisis came when General Jose Maria Lombardini's division broke through the American left flank, creating a gap that threatened to roll up the entire defensive position. Mexican soldiers poured through the breach, their triumphant shouts echoing across the battlefield as they sensed victory within their grasp. For a few terrifying minutes, it appeared that Santa Anna's strategy had succeeded and that Taylor's army would be destroyed piecemeal, but the American response was swift and decisive. Colonel Jefferson Davis, his 1st Mississippi Rifles again proving their worth at the crucial moment, led a desperate countercharge into the Mexican breakthrough. The Mississippians, fighting with the fury of men who knew their backs were to the wall, crashed into the advancing enemy column and brought their momentum to a grinding halt. Davis himself was wounded in the melee, but continued to lead his men from horseback, until loss of blood forced him to be carried from the field. Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery battery, firing over open sights at point-blank range, provided crucial support for the infantry counterattack. Bragg's gunners, working with mechanical precision despite the chaos around them, loaded their pieces with canister and grape shot. That turned the narrow valley into a killing ground. The young captain, who would later achieve notoriety as a Confederate general, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that made American artillery so effective. Throughout the Mexican War, the fighting reached a crescendo when Santa Anna personally led a final cavalry charge against the American center, hoping that his presence would inspire his men to break through where previous attacks had failed. The Mexican general, resplendent in his elaborate uniform and mounted on a magnificent charger, presented a target that American riflemen found irresistible. Though Santa Anna escaped injury, several of his staff officers fell around him, and his horse was shot from under him during the charge. As information documented in the History Reader indicates, the tide of battle turned decisively when American reinforcements, including elements of the 3rd Indiana Infantry that had been held in reserve, arrived at the critical moment to shore up the wavering defense. These fresh troops, though few in number, provided just enough additional firepower to stabilize the American line and allow the battered regiments to reorganize their positions. The Mexican assault began to falter as casualties mounted and ammunition ran low. Santa Anna's soldiers had fought with incredible courage and determination, but they could not sustain their attacks in the face of concentrated American artillery fire and the stubborn resistance of Taylor's infantry. By mid-morning, the Mexican forces were falling back toward their original positions, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded scattered across the contested ground. Santa Anna, recognizing that his army had shot its bolt and could not sustain another major assault, began to consider his options. His forces were still numerically superior, but morale was beginning to crack after 2 days of unsuccessful attacks against the determined American defense. The afternoon of February 23rd brought a deceptive calm to the battlefield as both armies paused to tend their wounds and assess their positions. Santa Anna's repeated assaults had been repulsed with heavy losses, but the Mexican general still commanded a formidable force that outnumbered Taylor's battered regiments by more than 3-1. The question hanging in the mountain air was whether the Americans could withstand one more determined attack, or if their ammunition and resolve would finally give out. General Taylor used the lull in fighting to redistribute his remaining forces and consolidate his defensive positions. The American line had been bent, but not broken during the morning's fighting, though several regiments had suffered casualties that reduced their effectiveness as fighting units. The 2nd Kentucky Infantry had lost nearly half its men, including the beloved Colonel McKee, who had fallen while leading a charge against Mexican positions. His death sent shockwaves through the American ranks, as McKee had been one of the most respected officers in the volunteer army. The ammunition situation had become critical for the Americans. Many infantry companies were down to fewer than 10 cartridges per man, while the artillery batteries were rationing their remaining rounds for only the most crucial targets. Captain Braxton Bragg reported that his guns had perhaps 24 shots remaining, barely enough for one brief engagement. If Santa Anna launched another major assault, the Americans would have to rely primarily on bayonets and determination rather than firepower. Unknown to Taylor, however, Santa Anna was facing his own crisis of confidence and supply. The Mexican general's army had suffered enormous casualties during 2 days of fighting, with estimates placing his losses at over 4,000 killed, wounded, and missing. More importantly, many of his remaining soldiers were showing signs of demoralization after their repeated failures to break the American defensive line. Desert rates were climbing as soldiers slipped away during the night. To return to their homes, the decisive moment came when Santa Anna ordered what he intended to be his final assault of the battle. Rather than another frontal attack, the Mexican general attempted a complex flanking maneuver designed to envelop the American position. from both sides simultaneously. The plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple divisions, something that proved difficult to achieve given the rough terrain and the communication problems that plagued 19th century armies. The Mexican attack began with General Micon's cavalry sweeping around the American right flank, while General Amputia's infantry division pressed forward against the center of Taylor's line. For a few crucial minutes, it appeared that Santa Anna's strategy might succeed. Where brute force had failed, Mexican horsemen penetrated deep into the American rear area, threatening the supply trains and field hospitals that were essential to continued resistance. But Taylor had anticipated this possibility and had positioned his last reserve, a mixed force of regular infantry and volunteer cavalry, to meet exactly this threat. The American counterattack, led by Major Samuel Ringgold's battery of flying artillery, caught the Mexican cavalry in the open ground behind the main battle line and inflicted severe casualties with rapid-fire canister rounds. Ringgold himself was mortally wounded during the engagement, but his sacrifice helped save the American army from encirclement. The failure of the flanking attack marked the beginning of the end for Santa Anna's offensive operations, as reports from Britannica Encyclopedia confirm. The Mexican general's forces had reached the limits of their endurance. After 2 days of intense combat against a determined enemy, the combination of heavy casualties, supply shortages, and declining morale made it impossible to sustain offensive operations much longer. As evening approached on February 23rd, Santa Anna made the difficult decision to begin withdrawing his army from the battlefield. The Mexican general, who had staked his reputation and political future on destroying Taylor's force, could not bring himself to admit defeat publicly. Instead, he ordered his army to fall back towards Saltillo under cover of darkness, claiming that he needed to reorganize for another assault. While privately acknowledging that his campaign had failed, the American soldiers, exhausted and bloodied, but still in possession of the field, watched in amazement as their vastly superior enemy began to withdraw. Many could hardly believe that they had survived what had seemed like certain destruction just hours earlier. Taylor himself, ever the pragmatist, used the opportunity to strengthen his positions and prepare for what he assumed would be renewed fighting the following day.